Channel open. Welcome back to Weekly Trek, a Star Trek news podcast presented by TrekCore.com. I am your host, Alex Perry.
What's today's date? The date.
Today's show was recorded on January 7th, 2026, and is current through Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 3, so beware of spoilers. Alright, let's get into the show.
Good day, Voyager, and welcome to A Briefing with Neelix. It's a catchy title, isn't it?
Weekly Trek is a regular news show covering the biggest stories from the Star Trek franchise. We are in the Alex Kurtzman era of Star Trek with the 12th television show currently in production and 14 movies to enjoy, and merchandise continuing to fill the Bajoran wormhole. So stick with me and I'll help you sort the real facts from a lot of the Dominion propaganda that you'll find online. And today's episode is a special episode of sorts. No guests for this conversation. I have a show coming in a couple of days where we'll be talking about the news of the week, including the news from right before Christmas about the casting of McCoy and Sulu for Strange New Worlds' series finale. But today, the review embargo for Star Trek Starfleet Academy has lifted, not for the specific episodes, but for no spoiler reviews for the show as a whole. And I really want to tell you what I think about Starfleet Academy. I don't have any reviewing duties for Starfleet Academy. The official no spoiler review for TrekCore.com is written by our good friend and colleague Jen Tift, and the weekly episodic reviews will be done by Mr. Trek Ranks Jim Morehouse himself. But I couldn't resist the opportunity to share some of my thoughts about this new show as we get ready for the premiere next Thursday, January 15th. And I want to preface this by saying I actually don't think you should listen to this. I'm really looking for an outlet to talk about how I feel about the show. This will not be a spoiler-filled conversation. I will not be discussing any specific plot points, what any of the episodes are about. I'll talk only in broad terms about the characters. I have seen the first 6 episodes of season 1. The reason I personally wouldn't listen to this is because I think, just like I had the opportunity, that you should go in completely fresh and form your own opinion. But given that I am eager to talk about this show with someone, aka my listener audience, and also because I know there are some people who are skeptical about this show, wondering if it's for them, wondering if this is something that they will enjoy, and maybe are looking for a second opinion from hopefully someone you trust after 294 episodes of Weekly Trek, that I would tell you a little bit in no spoiler terms how I felt about Starfleet Academy. And so if your goal is to go in completely without being influenced by anybody's opinion about Starfleet Academy, then stop listening to this episode now and come back to it after you've had the opportunity to see at least a couple of episodes, and then you can listen and decide whether you agree with my opinion or not. But if you are someone who is interested in hearing someone's opinion about Starfleet Academy, maybe to help make your own decision about whether you want to watch this show, then buckle up, because I'm going to tell you a bit about how I feel about Starfleet Academy. So I want to start, when I do episodes like this, they typically reach a wider audience than my regular episodes of Weekly Trek. And so I want to sort of start off, if you're listening to me for the first time, sort of establishing a little bit about how I approach Starfleet Academy. Who is this guy? How do I benchmark his opinion about Starfleet Academy against how he feels about the other shows, so that, you know, you're in a position to know how you should take my opinion. So here's where I am in terms of Star Trek right now. Obviously, lifelong Star Trek fan, huge fan of everything, effectively. I mean, especially, you know, I started watching TNG when I was a wee lad, and that ran through Deep Space Nine and Voyager and Enterprise. Was absolutely gutted when Enterprise went off the air. Enjoyed the Kelvin Timeline movies, have been so excited for the new era of Star Trek, have enjoyed the hits and the misses of the new era of Star Trek. But I enter 2026, or I guess I ended 2025, perhaps I should say, maybe that sort of starts to hint the direction that this review is going in, feeling a little burned out on the modern Star Trek discourse. Not necessarily on the Kurtzman era of Star Trek itself, but definitely feeling really burned out around everybody talking about the Kurtzman era of Star Trek. There's a previous episode, probably in November, where I went into more detail about that, when the poster for Starfleet Academy that was released that had the cadets in sort of a 90210 style pose. I talked in more detail about my sort of sense of being burned out about modern Star Trek discourse, especially coming off of Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 3, that I thought got a lot of criticisms that I didn't necessarily think that it deserved. I think in addition to being burned out by the Star Trek discourse around the Kurtzman era, also been feeling a bit glum about the contraction of the franchise from its heyday in 2023. Weekly Trek probably shouldn't be called Weekly Trek anymore, because it's not a show I can do weekly, because there's not enough Star Trek news to justify doing a weekly news show. I do it whenever there are stories to talk about, and we're going to have an episode coming up next week. And actually, I think in December, I managed to get an episode out every week. And if there's enough news to talk about each week, I do that. But since the number of shows has declined, and since there has been this sort of big set of question marks about what comes next and not a ton of information, Weekly Trek has been more like bi-weekly Trek, or sometimes monthly Trek, because there's just not been so much Star Trek news to talk about. So definitely been feeling a bit glum about the sort of contracted nature of the Star Trek franchise. And I also did feel that, like, when you got to the end of it, 2025 didn't quite live up to the heights of previous years. I didn't feel like Strange New Worlds Season 3 deserved a lot of the criticisms it got, but at the same time, didn't quite have the same level of episodes that really hit the highest echelon of enjoyable Star Trek episodes for me, like we had in Seasons 1 and 2, and the less said about Section 31, the better. So, you know, we're heading into Starfleet Academy with that sort of context, and obviously, since this is inevitably going to get compared to Star Trek Discovery, I will also just kind of give you a quick potted synopsis of how I felt about Discovery. I like Star Trek Discovery, but I didn't love Star Trek Discovery. It's probably my least favorite of the live-action Star Trek shows. There was a lot to like about it, but I did have a number of issues with the show, particularly in Season 4 and 5, which didn't really connect with me the way I was hoping. I found the season-long stories to be pretty wearying by the end. The sort of like, it's a galactic threat in Season 1, followed by a galactic threat in Season 2, followed by a galactic threat in Season 3, followed by a galactic threat in Season 4, followed by a galactic threat in Season 5. It got very tiring. I felt like Discovery was a pretty dour show. It was very serious, and it was very self-serious, and it was covering a lot of serious issues. There's definitely important space for that, and important space for that within Star Trek, but I kind of got to the end of that show feeling like, while I had liked it, I hadn't loved it, and I sort of don't really feel like I need to see any of those characters again. Discovery, for me, was a super interesting Star Trek experiment of trying serialized storytelling, of trying something that was very modern, very progressive, and very sort of steeped in, I would say, a particular late 2010s political culture that, you know, I think was a really interesting experiment and had a lot going for it, but also I think fell short in a number of places, and yeah, just in a lot of ways didn't quite work for me the way I had wanted to. So with that in mind, now knowing how I feel about Star Trek as it stands right now, now knowing how I feel a bit about Star Trek Discovery, how do I feel about Star Trek Starfleet Academy? Of course, I'm doing this coming up to the 10-minute mark. I absolutely loved the first 6 episodes of Starfleet Academy. Not universally loved. It takes a couple of episodes to get going, but once it gets into it, this show is really something special. I think it's really important, having described how I feel about Star Trek Discovery, because of the inevitability of the comparisons that there will be between these two shows. I think it is really important, though, like, if there's one thing I want to impart over the course of however long I end up yapping for, it's that, please, even though this show looks like Star Trek Discovery, it has the same incredible production values, and because it's set in the same time period, the costumes are very similar, the ships are the same ships, the lighting's very similar, the set design's quite similar, some of the characters are the same, which we already know. Admiral Vance appears, and Jet Reno appears, and so, like, you know, there's a lot of sort of shared DNA between Discovery and Starfleet Academy, but one of the themes of my show this year, as we've been talking about Starfleet Academy, was my sort of sense of, yeah, it's going to share a lot of that DNA because they're set in the same sort of time period, and a lot of the production crew will be the same, but a lot of the writers are not the same, and this is not the same show, and it is about a different set of characters. And so I really think it's important, like, my one sort of thing I would implore you as somebody who's going to watch Starfleet Academy is please treat the show as its own thing and not the 6th season of Discovery, because it is not the 6th season of Discovery. I do think in the first couple of episodes, the vibes of the show are maybe a bit closer to Discovery than in later episodes, but I think by episode 3, the show really starts to distinguish itself as its own thing. And so I would say, if you listen to this and then go, great, maybe I have my issues with Discovery, and that is something that is causing me to be skeptical about Starfleet Academy, and then you start watching it, having heard me say it's not the 6th season of Discovery, and you watch the first episode and you go, I don't know, this feels pretty Discovery-ish to me. Please hold on and continue to watch the show for at least a few more episodes, because I think you will come around to my way of thinking, which is that really by the time the show gets to sort of episode 3-ish, it's really starting to define itself as its own thing and distinguish itself as a unique, really interesting, really compelling entry into the Star Trek franchise. I will say I think the characters are great. You know, there is this sort of sense of concern amongst a lot of people about the idea of Starfleet Academy being a show really focused on young people, that this is sort of a quote-unquote young adult show. And it is those things in many ways. The main cast and the main focus of attention of this show is largely on its freshman cadets. And so the show is gonna kind of live or die based off of those cadets, many of whom are actors who, because they are 19, 20, 21, don't have a lot of acting credits. And so, you know, there's a lot riding on them, right? A whole show lives or dies based off of the acting chops of a group of actors who may have a lot of natural innate talent, but haven't necessarily gotten the experience to be able to deploy that talent appropriately. I don't think that's a concern for any of these actors. I mean, I'm deeply compelled both by these characters and by the performances that are given. The cadets all have really distinct identities. They're all really interesting characters. This is a show that leans really hard into character in a way that I think completely works. And it's actually a much more character-focused show than Strange New Worlds. Strange New Worlds obviously has a lot about its characters, but I felt like in these 6 episodes that I was watching of Starfleet Academy, we were seeing much more character episodes than we see on Strange New Worlds, which are episodic shows where things happen that feature certain characters. This one felt to me like if a character was the center of an episode, it was about that character and who that character was. And that is that really works within the context of it being a group of young people. I think one of the things I maybe struggled a little bit with Discovery was there was a ton of sort of character growth and development and exploration, but it was all happening to a group of people for whom there was this sort of natural inclination to say, shouldn't you have figured some of this stuff out by now, right? Like, you know, I think one of the things that some fans really kind of, it grated against them was this idea of Starfleet's a very professional organization. You know, we'll set aside the extent to which you want to say Starfleet is a military organization. That's obviously a key tension within the whole Star Trek franchise that the show has kind of explored in various ways, including, not so successfully, but it explored it in this most recent season of Strange New Worlds, the episode What is Starfleet? But like this idea of this group of people going through these really serious things after all of the really rigorous training that they would have received to become Starfleet officers. They're in some cases long careers with doing this. I know a lot of people for whom they were like, I don't care about that. You know, well, you think old people don't have mental problems, right? Like, you think old people don't have issues to address? Of course they do. And I want to see that on my TV. I think there are a lot of people for whom it was like, well, this sort of, you know, creates unprofessional situations for this group of people. And like, and Discovery had this very strong philosophy around that none of that matters, right? Like, if you, in order to grow as a person, you need to, one, get therapy. That was a really strong theme of Star Trek Discovery. And two, like, grow through the sharing and grow through the connecting. Starfleet Academy doesn't really have that same, at least, you know, and it's only 6 episodes deep that I have seen. So, you know, it's not like I can say the whole show's gonna end up feeling this way. One, I don't feel like it has that sort of very specific viewpoint around growth. But it also is just really interesting that it just, like, all of that works so much better when the characters are 19 and 20, because you're an idiot when you're 19 and 20, and you do have these things that this baggage you're bringing to the table and these kinks in your personality that you need to work out and chips on your shoulder that being at college, which is what Starfleet Academy is, and being in that kind of environment gives you the space to be an idiot, to screw up, to learn about yourself, to learn what you need to do better, and then do that. And I think, you know, by virtue of it happening to this group of young people, it actually makes a lot of that kind of deeper character work really interesting to me. And I think the kind of angles for all of the characters are very good. I would say in episode 1, the characters feel like more lightly sketched. They're more archetypal. You know, you've got one character that fits into the specific kind of, you know, like young person group mold, and then another character who serves this role and another character who serves this, you know, you've got the asshole character, and it's like, okay, you're the asshole character, right? Like, I wish there was a little bit more to you. But honestly, even within 6 episodes, all of these characters have so much more to them than you're exposed to even within the pilot. I think the pilot does a good job of sort of introducing you to these characters and their archetypes, but then every episode thereafter starts to deconstruct those archetypes for the characters and kind of show you more about them and show you why they are the way they are and what contributes to that and the journey that they're on to becoming whole people and becoming adults. And so there is this sort of core group of young people. It is a show about young people, and it all works really well. But the adults are also great. I mean, Holly Hunter is an absolute revelation, and she is so good in this role. It took me an episode or 2 to really, like, click with her character and what she was trying to do, but she falls very comfortably into the role of Nala Arke, the captain of the Athena and the Chancellor of Starfleet Academy. She's a very different Star Trek captain than we've seen before, but I mean that in the best way. It's an incredibly distinct performance from Kate Mulgrew as Janeway and Sonequa Martin Green as Michael Burnham as the previous female live-action leads, and I love that. It's a different way into leadership. It's a different way into being an educator, right? That's the really interesting dynamic of this show is the adult characters are Starfleet officers and they're educators, and this show doesn't shy away from that. It grapples with that, and it sort of gives these adult characters these really interesting arcs of their own. I mean, Holly Hunter's character has, over the first 6 episodes, a really great arc, and I have really loved everything I have seen about her character and her performance, which again is very distinctive and not sort of the classic Star Trek captain mold, but also is the classic Star Trek captain mold in its own unique way. And so, like, I mean, as sort of the masthead actor for Star Trek Starfleet Academy, we could not be more privileged to have Holly Hunter leading a Star Trek show. I will say, I've talked about this a bit already. I do think the show takes a couple of episodes to kind of really get comfortable with itself. That's very natural for any TV show, but I think is true for Starfleet Academy as well. As I say, the vibe in the first couple of episodes feels a lot like Discovery, and it does sort of feel like like most shows in their first couple of episodes, both the writers and the actors are sort of setting in and finding the characters' voices. Episodes 1 and 2 I liked, I didn't love. Then in episode 3, the show really started to interest me. And then episode 4, 5, and 6, I think are some of the best episodes in modern Star Trek. I mean, really episodes that resonated with me in a really big way. In addition to Holly Hunter, the other adult characters are all great. Gina Yashiri as Laura Thok is so great. The character starts a little cartoonish again in the sort of first couple of episodes. A lot of the characters kind of feel like sort of broadly kind of sketched pastiches, but again, also the character settles really quickly, is a really interesting character. All the sort of like, how do we have a female Jem'Hadar? Don't worry about it. It's all, like, it all fits perfectly well within the Star Trek canon. And she's a great character and connected to something I'm going to talk about in a second. Tig Notaro is a really great addition to the cast and a great carryover from Discovery. I was sort of a little bit like, oh, I don't know about like Tig being one of the sort of Discovery characters that moves over to Starfleet Academy. Works incredibly. Oded Fair is back as Admiral Charles Vance, also great. There are other adult characters I really liked, but I feel it get a little too spoilerish to talk about them because there's some dynamics to Starfleet Academy that haven't sort of fully been revealed yet, that are sort of really interesting world-building pieces about the 32nd century that I don't want to spoil for you, so I'm just going to kind of leave that there. And then, of course, there's the Doctor, and Bob Picardo hasn't skipped a beat, and his presence in the show is a delight. The Doctor feels like he has a bit of a story of his own that's going to play out over the course of season 1, and it's just so nice to have that character there. The other big thing that really sets Starfleet Academy apart, actually, I think from a lot of the live action show, I'm not just talking about Discovery now, I'm also talking about Picard, I'm also talking about Strange New Worlds, is how funny it is. The show is really funny. I think one of the reasons why, some fans didn't really click with Discovery was because it was a really serious show and didn't give you many moments of levity. It was serious upon serious upon serious. I think Starfleet Academy thrived because it has a lot of serious character stuff, but it also has lots of humor. This is actually a really funny show. It may be even a little slapstick at times. It might even go too far for some people. I'm going to be really interested to see how people kind of vibe with the humor of this show. And I do think in the early episodes, you sort of see them playing around with how funny should this show be. And I think by episode 6, which is the last one that I have seen, it sort of has found that really nice balance where it's funny, but not like in a weird way, but it is also funny because that's an important part of the human experience. And it's an important part of enjoying these stories and enjoying these characters, is that there's some humor there. I mean, not every joke lands, but many really hit. I mean, there are some real laugh out loud jokes in this show and some laugh out loud character stuff that I think a lot of people are really going to enjoy, and gives the show a lightness and gives the 32nd century a lightness that we haven't necessarily seen up until this point. The show is very episodic. By the end of episode 6, there are story arcs that do sort of recur throughout the show, but there's no single underlying story of the season like there was with Discovery. The character work is a little more serialized than Strange New Worlds, but each of the episodes is very distinctive, and the stakes are appropriate for a show about Starfleet Academy. So there are no galaxy-ending threats here, just people being people in the Star Trek world, and to the extent there are stories that carry across episodes, those are largely grounded in the characters, not in the events, right? There's not sort of at least in the first 6 episodes, one sort of through line narrative where you can say, this season is about the Red Angel, or about what caused the burn, or about, like there isn't that. And I think, that's super appropriate for a show about a group of people who are 19 and 20. They're not going to be the ones who are saving the galaxy. That doesn't mean they don't have important things to do. That doesn't mean they don't find themselves in dangerous or difficult situations. And it doesn't mean that there aren't stakes to the show. But I think if you're like, I'm really worried we're back to sort of the season-long, highly serialized arcs where it's all around some big problem that needs to be solved, that's not Starfleet Academy. It looks more like Strange New Worlds than it does Discovery in that regard. Though I think the character stuff is a little deeper and therefore a little bit more serialized than Strange New Worlds has done. There's also really great world building. Starfleet Academy really quickly kind of dives deep into the world of the 32nd century in a way that Discovery did a bit, but only in service of those larger stories they were trying to tell. It wasn't, world building that doesn't serve the larger story wouldn't have worked in Discovery, and so they didn't do a lot of that. But in Starfleet Academy, because the show's a bit different, you do have the opportunity to go a lot deeper. You get a much better sense, in my opinion, of the 32nd century in 6 episodes than you did across a couple of seasons of Discovery. Again, that show wasn't sort of, necessarily designed to do that, but it does really help with making this period of time feel lived in. I mean, I think the other thing too that also really contributes to that, which is not Discovery's fault, was that crew had gone to the 32nd century, and so they always kind of felt a little bit like they were outsiders there. Starfleet Academy is about characters who were born and grew up in the 32nd century. This is their world, and so it just feels a little bit more lived in. And so to the extent, I would say I completely understand all the reasons why, Alex Kurtzman has talked about wanting to set this in the Discovery time frame because of, everything that's kind of going on right now and making a show that's relatable for young people. I was really disappointed the show wasn't set in the, sort of 24th, 25th century time frame, because that's the Starfleet Academy I wanted to see. And I kind of held that against the show going into it a little bit. I don't feel that way at all now. I really think the setting they've chosen is appropriate to the show that they've created and serves it in a really interesting way. And it does feel highly topical and highly relevant to the world we have outside our windows right now, rather than if they'd done it in the late 24th, early 25th century. That's much more of a utopian, idealistic place. This is not to say that Starfleet Academy isn't utopian and idealistic. It very much is. This is not a grimdark future. This is the classic Star Trek utopian, hopeful future. But it's one that requires a little bit more work in the 32nd century because of the events of the burn than it does in the 24th, 25th century. And as a result, feels much more resonant with being a show debuting in 2026 than if they'd gone in the direction that I wanted them to go in. I think Paul Giamatti is a delicious Star Trek villain. He is absolutely hamming it up. He's talked about this in interviews, but in a way that feels completely of a kind with so many other delicious Star Trek villains. The performance doesn't quite click in the pilot. That clip that they released, the origami chicken clip, is half of the potential of how good this character can be, and how good this character can be when facing off against Holly Hunter's Nala Arke, and that's all I'll say about that. But I love Giamatti's performance as Noose Braka outside of what we've already seen. And, when it all clicks together, when the show's a little bit more comfortable with itself, when Holly Hunter's a bit more comfortable as Arke, when Giamatti's a bit more comfortable as Braka, and when the writers kind of lock in on these two characters, great things happen, and I will just leave it at that. I don't have many criticisms of the show. I did genuinely really love it. And part of why I wanted to do this episode was because I've done a couple of reacting to a thing happening in Star Trek world where it's just me talking to the mic, and the last one I did was about Section 31, and it's one of my most downloaded episodes I've ever done, but it's one in which I'm just being so critical of that show. And given how much I really love Starfleet Academy, I really wanted to jump on the mic and kind of balance out those scales for the Weekly Trek feed to kind of tell you about something that I really liked and really enjoyed. So I don't have many criticisms of the show at this point beyond it having taken a couple of episodes to find itself. But what show doesn't take a couple of episodes to find itself? If I had to stretch to one, this is not necessarily a criticism more than it is an observation that there's something about this show that will not work for a lot of fans. It is a very contemporary show. There is more modern music. There's a lot more modern cursing than you've ever seen or heard before in Star Trek. That's definitely going to rub a lot of older fans the wrong way, and even I balked at it a little bit because, it's this is Star Trek and you're saying that word, that I've never really heard that kind of sort of term or phrase or word in Star Trek before. It's sort of, I can't even remember. I mean, there's nothing like too bad, but it's just like very contemporary, slangy swearing. And you'll know what I'm talking about when those moments come up. And like, that's going to bump some people the wrong way because they're really used to the theatrical Shakespearean way of doing dialogue from the Berman era. And the Kurtzman era has sort of never done that, but it's not doing that in the biggest way in Starfleet Academy. And so it sort of, it is its own thing, but I think it's really appropriate for the audience the show is trying to reach. I don't know that a show with that sort of very Shakespearean dialogue in 2026 is going to land with the audience the show's trying to reach today, which is young adults. And so I do think it's, I'm fine with it, but I'm just kind of warning you that is something about the show. And so if that's something you're sensitive to, just know going in that is a dynamic of the show. But Starfleet Academy has re-energized my passion for Star Trek entering the 60th anniversary year. I think it celebrates Star Trek, it revels in being Star Trek, but is also its own unique thing. Do I love it so much because my expectations were pretty low for it going in? I actually don't think so. I think by the midpoint of season 1, the show has settled into being something really special, and I cannot tell you how excited I am for seeing the last 4 episodes of season 1. Like, I really want to see those episodes now, because when you get to the end of episode 6, it's like, oh, mama, this show's really, really working in a big way. There's really special stuff in the first 6 episodes. This is also not a show to sleep on. Like, there are some of these episodes you are going to want to watch with no spoilers. I cannot stress that enough. You don't want to sleep on this show. For some of these episodes, you are going to want no spoilers. And so please do your best to watch within the context of the first 6 episodes. Please do your best to watch these episodes as quickly as possible if you don't want to get spoilers, because there's some stuff in some of these episodes that is going to break really big on the internet. And so I'm obviously not going to say more about it because I don't want you to be spoiled or start theorizing about what that means. But if you're interested in watching Starfleet Academy and you're interested in having a uniquely you experience, try and watch them as quickly as you can on the day that they're released, and you will have a very special experience. Last thing I'll say is just, I know my audience, I know the people who download WeeklyTrek. It's not the 18, 19, and 20-year-olds that Starfleet Academy is trying to appeal to. I'm 38 years old. I'm going to guess that's probably the average age of that's probably on the lower end of the age range for the listenership that I have. So I know who I'm talking to. You know who you are. We are we're not the OG some of us are OG Star Trek fans. I know I've got some listeners who watched TOS either in original run or in its 1970s kind of rerun explosion of popularity, went to see motion picture, on opening night. But I know, because I'm part of this generation, the generation of Star Trek fans who came after that, the sort of next generation of Star Trek fans, if you will, who really locked into the next generation, then Deep Space Nine, then Voyager, then Enterprise, your sort of Gen X millennial Star Trek fans. And, some of us are a bit skeptical about this show, right? We're reaching the point where it feels like it is possible, with a show that was for kids and a show that was then for literal babies and a show that's now for young adults, that we are not necessarily aging out the Star Trek franchise, plenty of Star Trek for us to watch, but that Star Trek is not being made for us anymore. It was in the 90s and all through the 2000s and even through parts of the 2010s, but now it's being made for the next generation of Star Trek fans who Paramount and Alex Kurtzman are trying to foster and create right now. And so, we might be looking at this and saying, well, maybe this isn't for us. And so knowing that is my audience, long-standing Star Trek fans, many of whom love lots of what's happened, but some of whom might have some issues with it, I will just say this about Star Trek Starfleet Academy. My message to you is, I hope that you give this show a chance, and I am so glad that I did. All right, that's my feelings about Star Trek Starfleet Academy. I can't wait to hear what your feelings were about this show once it releases next Thursday, and talking about it each week and all of the fun stuff we have to look forward to. Do you have an opinion, theory, or wish about Star Trek that you'd like to share? Email them to me at weeklytrek@trekcore.com, and I might feature your thoughts in a future episode. Well, that's all the time we've got for this episode of Weekly Trek. You can find the show on X at Weekly Trek, and me at Alexander T. Perry on X, and at Alex T. Perry on Blue Sky, and everywhere else. And if you enjoy the show, please consider leaving us a 5-star review on your podcast player of choice. And for all your Star Trek news needs, in addition to our extensive media archives of all things Star Trek, I hope you will keep your senses locked to trekcore.com. Well, thank you everybody for listening, and until next week, live long and prosper. Weekly Trek is a production of trekcore.com and owned by Trapezoid Media, LLC.